I didn't even touch it. There we go.
Really?
Okay, now
Did you lose
now
it?
it's somehow recording. No, we're all good. So let's get this rolling without further ado. You can get yourself. Do you want to maximize that real quick? Yeah, go ahead and maximize that. Should see it in a second. There we are. Okay, we're all set. So now we'll start for real. So Bryan Laskin today is our guest speaker. And Bryan's the owner of Opera DDS. He's also a dentist in Minnesota. He's a friend of mine. And I've got to know Bryan over the course of the last year. I'm always very impressed, especially as a software engineer, watching someone from a non-software background develop a very impressive software application. I'm very impressed at what Bryan's done with it. And I'm always interested to talk to him about the business of running a dental practice. And in particular, what he's going to talk to us today about is some of the things he's done to help improve patient case acceptance and some other things, and how his software has helped him do that. So without further ado, Bryan, why don't you fill us in on anything else I missed and tell us what you have to say.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity, and the respect is mutual. I'm always amazed at what great dental websites is doing, and how you focus just on I would call it a narrow specific niche of dental practices. You've got a keen focus on what dentists need particularly. That's all you do, and you do it well, to quote sort of an attorney ad based in Minneapolis. But yeah, maybe just to kind of piggyback on what Jeff said, my practice is located in a suburb of Minneapolis. I have now 4 associate full-time dentists, a surgeon that comes in a few times a month, and we're having an orthodontist coming in soon too. And so it's a busy place. And what we're going to be talking about today, get your head in the cloud, which means basically how to use online tools to increase the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the productivity of your office. I think in dentistry, which we are very technologically focused group of people. It's a profession that we use technology heavily. However, for some reason, cloud-based technologies have, in my opinion, been slow to be adopted. And I think it's because how the profession overall views cloud technologies and kind of going at it from in my perspective, maybe the wrong way, and I'll talk about that. My contact information is up on the screen. It's Bryan with a Y, B-R-Y-A-N, at operadds.com. Opera for like the music, but also it's short for operatory. It's an operatory communication system. operadds.com. That's my office phone number. My office is called Lake Minnetonka Dental, and we can talk more about that. And just the best way to contact me is my email address if you have any questions. So again, the purpose of this webinar, my goal is to help you increase your profitability and to decrease your liability. And I think oftentimes when people talk about increasing profitability and liability, these things are separate buckets. And in my opinion, they go together hand in glove, basically. I think that as we use these tools to decrease our liability, they actually increase our efficiency and profitability. And I'll talk how to do that. While we're doing that, we're also going to be increasing our patient satisfaction and positioning your practice as a technology leader. That's something that's really rapidly growing in my practice. I'm a nerd. I've always loved software and products and been sort of on the cutting edge of technology just because that's what I like to do. But now what I've seen in the last few years is that patients more and more are looking for that. And I'm sure we've all had people Googling us more and things like that. And as that increases, I think it's important to position yourself as a leader in technology, and that's not expensive or difficult to do, as I'll talk about. Talked a little bit about kind of where I'm coming from. That's a picture of my practice. It's an old picture, so there's a couple dentists that we've added since then. My staff is about twice that size, actually. But that is the building that I purchased in 2011, so it was actually less than 4 years ago. We've since just recently done an expansion, so we were on the 3rd floor of the building, took over the lowest level, so we've been kind of growing growing a lot. And the reason why I mention that is that these tools are part of how we've grown, and they sprang from me building the office and getting frustrated with the current communication systems that were in place, and that's how I kind of developed some online tools, and now they're becoming much more commonplace. I feel strongly that communication is the key to effective, less stressful profitability. I think the cornerstone of a good practice is good communication, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So an overview of what we'll be talking about. I'll be summarizing Hipaa, which I think is grossly misunderstood in our profession. I also want to point out that I'm not going to go over the history of how Hipaa came to be, which I've heard a lot of times, and frankly, I don't think it really matters. What matters is where we are today and where we're going, and I'll tell you kind of a practical, from a practical standpoint, how to deal with Hipaa, in my opinion. Also be talking about how being Hipaa compliant is also leading you on a pathway to profitability, and how we talked about communication being the key to profitability. And in particular, I'll talk a little bit about case acceptance and how to use online tools and good intra-office communication to increase case acceptance. How to eliminate phone calls with your specialists, your other doctors and laboratories, your patients even, phone calls, emails, unsecure ways of communication, and just basically cumbersome ways. And also, we talked about it before, but effective ways to promote yourself as being on the cusp of technology. So backing up to the first point, Hipaa, and it's sort of a subset of Hipaa, which is called high tech. And I think there's a lot of fear that's been propagated by people who are in the Hipaa space, let me put it that way. And I think a lot of people viewed, particularly a while ago, maybe 6 months, a year ago, everybody was focused on the verbiage in your office. For example, if I'm talking to if I'm talking to Jane in one operatory, to make sure that Sue next door can't hear it. And that's obviously a piece of Hipaa. We have to be careful with our privacy policies and how we communicate within the office, having physical barriers up and things like that, so that we keep that information private. But what I think people are becoming more knowledgeable about now is the electronic transmission of data. So if I send an email with Jeff Gladnick's name in it, saying that he needs to have orthodontics to my orthodontist, that's actually a violation of Hipaa, and we'll talk about why. So we have to be, it's called Electronic Personal Health Information, or EPHI. Oftentimes, many people aren't even aware of what this is. For example, sending a simple x-ray has metadata, so data that's actually embedded into that x-ray that includes this information. So even if you don't identify the patient by name, if you send that radiograph, there is EPHI associated with it. And I think, like many regulations, the spirit of the law is sound, but the details are complicated and ambiguous. The reason why I say this is that, I think we can all agree that if I'm sending, if you would have, let's say you have a malignant tumor, and your physician is sending that to an oncologist, you would want that electronic transmission to be private. You don't want that to be public information. So, and that's really what the electronic piece of Hipaa and high tech is trying to do, is protect that patient information. And I think that pretty much everybody would agree that that's necessary. When you get into the details of it, that's where things get ambiguous and complicated, and we'll talk more about that. But I like to think of Hipaa as kind of a new OSHA, meaning that if you think of infection control, I think we can all agree that infection control is necessary. Gloves have been a big advantage to the practice, but the specific details of OSHA can numb your mind. And so I'll try to give a practical overview of Hipaa, as if we, as a good OSHA provider, will give you a good practical view of OSHA. So little detail about who breaches or how breaches happen. How does data get stolen, basically? And the most common cause, and it might seem a little obvious, is the low-hanging fruit. But what that really means is that most commonly, HIPAA breaches happen by theft of a local computer or a USB drive, a portable device. What that means is that somebody breaks into your office and steals your server. That's a common one, because your server includes obviously a lot of personal health information. Or a disgruntled employee who reports an office who doesn't have good HIPAA policies. Basically, if you fire somebody and they know that you're not in compliance, they may mention something to the board. Not too dissimilar to OSHA violations. I think there's also a misconception about how breaches happen. Oftentimes people view, like when they see lots of things make it on the news, Target gets breached, that's a hometown company of mine, or Sony gets breached, and people think that it's hackers hacking into big servers that are common HIPAA breaches. It's actually the least common. Cyber attacks typically happen most commonly on a small scale, local servers, smaller servers, because they're easier to break into. The large cloud providers like Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Google, they are the ones that have the most to lose because they're this backbone to the cloud. So they have the best security measures in place. And so in my opinion, it's best to use providers that piggyback onto the sort of the juggernauts that are creating the cloud, because they're going to be the hardest ones to break into. They're not impossible, of course, but they're going to be there's going to be the lowest risk when we're going cloud, and we'll talk more about kind of what the cloud is. And I also want to point out that we're talking about the breaching here, but realize it's a low risk. I'm not trying to scare people into what HIPAA is, but there is a significant impact, and here's what the significant impact is. If you have a HIPAA breach that includes more than 500 people's data, so let's say your server is stolen and you have more than 500 patients' information on there, you have to notify all those individuals. You have to send out a major press release within 60 days. You have to have it on your website for 90 days. You have to notify the human health services, the secretary. You have to notify all of your business associates, and if anybody has questions about business associates, we can talk about that later. There are fines between $50,000 and $250,000 most commonly. And just to kind of make a point that last year there was $7 million in HIPAA breach fines that were created, and in 2010 it was less than $1 million. So this is not. I'm not trying to scare people about HIPAA, because I still, again, think the risk is low, but if it does happen, it's significant. So this is why, in my opinion, that much like the risk of getting hepatitis from a needle stick is low, if it does happen, it's significant, and so we want to mitigate that risk as much as possible. And that's why, in my opinion, that 10 years from now, we're not going to be having a discussion, why do we need HIPAA? We're going to be talking about the best ways and how we can incorporate things, much like needle sticks. What are the best precautions? But we all can agree that we have to pay attention to needle sticks. In my opinion, big picture, the reason why we have to be protecting patients' data is because it's the right thing to do. You wouldn't want your personal information taken. I wouldn't want my personal information taken. And as I'll show you, it's not only the right thing to do, it leads to better care, and it also leads us to being more efficient and profitable. So there's a lot of fear in the industry that I've heard about the HIPAA and the regulations, and saying how it's garbage and I'm not going to pay attention to it and that kind of thing, but I think it's going to be changing. Again, I think it's like OSHA. When I was in dental school, which was several moons ago, but it wasn't that long ago, I had dental school instructors who would ask to remove their gloves if they would ask the patients to remove their gloves to do something because they thought it would help their tactile sense. But I don't think that's really going on much anymore, and I think that using online tools will be similar, have a similar impact over the next 10, 20 years. So what do we do about it? How do we comply? How do we become more efficient? So it's, again, it's not too dissimilar from OSHA. We have to designate a Hipaa officer within our office. It can be yourself. You just have to have in writing who it is and get some training. Just like OSHA, there's good, inexpensive alternatives. I put two very good ones on the screen, yourhipaatraining.com and Dental Enhancements. They both, Your Hipaa Training is mainly an online module, so it's kind of self-directed, very inexpensive. Dental Enhancements will call you up and you can do it on speakerphone, and they give you a workbook and walk you through everything. There's many other ones out there. There's lots of good trainers out there. I'm not a Hipaa trainer. It's kind of like having an OSHA officer versus the person that creates the barriers and things like that. I do more of the barriers. I don't do the training, and so that's a piece of the puzzle that you certainly want to have in place. The next piece of the puzzle is obviously being aware of your workflow and how you choose to do your electronic transfers to the cloud. And I've mentioned the cloud several times. It's in the title of this lecture. What exactly is the cloud? This might be rudimentary for some, but I thought it would be good to go over it. Basically, it's taking your network and your software, your hardware, and having somebody else take care of it. So you're outsourcing your computer needs. Instead of having your PC be doing the work, you're having a computer outside of your office, outside of your network, taking the load. How is the cloud different from having your internal network doing it? Well, number one, you can use it on demand, like electricity. You just use as much as you just use as much as you want. You don't have to overbuy, like you don't have to buy a gigantic server with tons of storage just in case you need to use it, or you don't have to worry about not having enough. There's nothing for you to maintain or update. And also, one of the things about the cloud that's different is, unlike if you have a computer in your office that goes to, let's say, a server in your back room, that's a direct connection. In the cloud, there's multiple connections usually that are made. And why that is important is that traditional services like Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, these aren't Hipaa compliant. And part of that is because of those multiple connections. This screen shows you that on the left-hand side, there's a dentist who has a competent IT company that's provided firewalls, they're network secure, and she's ready to send off an email through Gmail to the dentist on the other side of the screen. And she sends it up to Gmail, who will then send it unsecurely to a bunch of other servers, and we don't know where and how that pathway goes, to the colleague's server, which we don't know how secure that is. And so there are plugins for all these features. I'm not sure if Dropbox has a plugin, but there are ways to make them Hipaa compliant, but it's complicated. But just using these traditional services sort of out of the box is not compliant. So how do we make our transmissions compliant? Number one, there's basically two ways of doing it, using a fully encrypted pathway from A to B. So it's encrypted on my end, it's encrypted on your end, and then there's a trusted pathway in between. This is more complicated than the second option, which I'll talk about next. It's expensive because we have to build out this pathway, and we have to have encryption on both sides. And it's still more vulnerable to theft. Well, what I mean by that, it's more vulnerable to breaches, because as we talked about before, most breaches happen on a local level. So that means in your office or outside of large sort of, if you can think of like a bank versus your house. It's going to be easier to break into your house and steal your wallet than to break in the bank. Both happen. Most commonly, banks don't get robbed, houses get robbed, and it's similar with this. So centralized cloud database is the second option, which requires a separate login, as do similar to the encryption, requires a username and password typically. It's less complicated than the encrypted pathway because it's one location, it's more secure, and it allows for more options, because instead of having three separate things to manage, there's one centralized location that everybody goes to. So here's a sort of a graphic of kind of what a centralized cloud location looks like. Again, maybe a little simplistic, but rather than having a direct transmission from A to B with a pathway, everybody logs into one place. So what that means is that you can rely on that cloud provider's security unless you download something to yourself locally. So if Dr. Doeswell sends something up to the cloud and it's secured there, and Ms. Cool Lab on the left downloads it to her server, what's important here is that Dr. Doeswell didn't send it directly to her. So that you don't have to worry about, from a liability standpoint, what's going on Ms. Cool Lab, because you've kind of fulfilled your obligation by sending it up to this cloud provider, as long as that cloud provider is doing what they need to do. So cloud-based communication, that centralized location, also allows for easy access. You can log in from mobile devices typically. There's no extra hardware. You can use whatever hardware you currently use. Doesn't require IT installation, so it's lower cost. As a developer, one of the things that's fantastic about cloud-based communication is that there's auto updates. You don't have to keep downloading the next version and the next version. It just automatically happens. And like we talked about, it has increased security. The challenges of the cloud. Big primary one is it's unknown at first. However, most people are using cloud-based services like Amazon, buying something off Amazon. You're buying something from the cloud. The challenges are obviously security, because we're putting something up into a network of computers, so we want to make sure that that's secure. It got cut off here, but it's not necessary for grandfathered in communication. So if you're sending a HIPAA compliant email, another way to do this that's not cloud-based would be to do it by fax or by phone. So obviously those are grandfathered in. So if you send a fax, which this still kind of blows my mind, I received a fax from my bank because they didn't want to go through a secure portal, and it went to my front desk where I had no idea the fax was coming in, and some details about a loan just kind of came across my front desk for everybody to see, which the reason why that's okay is because it was grandfathered in. Now it's perceived to be more expensive, but in my opinion, no, it's actually less expensive. There's many free online tools like Amazon and Google, Gmail. You know, Gmail's not HIPAA compliant, but there are HIPAA compliant free services. So going back to HIPAA compliant email, you know, what I would recommend looking for in a service that provides this HIPAA compliant email would be that it would work with any email address. So you can send it to anybody basically. There should be some extra security benefits because we're trying to be secure here. So it would be nice to be able to see if the person that you sent that message to viewed it. That actually is kind of a level of security, and the ability to retract that email if you sent it to the wrong provider. So if you send something to a patient and you realize that it was the wrong John Smith, it's nice to be able to take that back and send it to the right one. We send a lot of CT scans in my office, which are rather large files, so making sure that you can provide for large file attachments. It's simple to use, of course, making sure it's secure, inexpensive, and having a low number of limitations. In particular, I mean low number of limitations as to who you can communicate with. Making sure that it doesn't matter who you communicate with, you can do it securely. That's of primary importance in my opinion. Sure sounds like a pain. Actually, I think I put this slide in to just make the point that most industries that don't even require a level of security, like healthcare requires HIPAA, or the bank regulations require a communication pathway that's secure. Most industries are actually moving to cloud-based platforms. If you've heard of things like Basecamp or Trello or Workboard, chat applications or like Slack, these are exploding. And the reason why is because these cloud-based applications, the benefits that I talked about before, they're not subtle. They're huge advantages to traditional modes of communication. It's just healthcare kind of is slower to move along, and for some reason dentistry has been slow to move around in this area too. So, but that doesn't mean that it's not more effective, and hopefully I can show you how. So why go to the cloud? Why is it more effective? Simply put, you can get any information you want, when you want it, where you want it, and how you want it. It works anywhere, so it doesn't matter. Yesterday I was on my boat and I was sending something to an orthodontist from my phone. So it works any device, anywhere, and there's no software or hardware to install that's necessary. Most cloud providers have, there might be additional tools you can download to help things because there's limitations to browser-based applications. And obviously, most mobile devices, you know, like Google, Android, and Apple have specific needs that would require an application. So there's applications that are specific to mobile devices. Starting off with one, you know, in addition to email, how can we utilize the cloud to increase our effectiveness? A good way to start, in my opinion, is communicating with our specialists and laboratories. The way it's usually done with paper slips and mail and phone calls is incredibly inefficient. Takes a little bit of work on the front end. And from what that I mean, if you're working with an endodontist, let's say, you have to be working off the same system. You know, we just went through this. I'm in the I'm part of the Progressive Dentist magazine network, and we use Slack, for example, to do a little communication, and so everybody has to get on board and know how to use the easy to use tools. So once you get set up, the communication is great, but everybody has to be on board and has to get set up. One way that this makes incredible advances in case acceptance, in my opinion, is patient fee coordination. For example, if you're doing an implant and you're working with an oral surgeon, if the oral surgeon can't tell you their fees, can't tell you how much a bone graft or if a bone graft is necessary, and you give a patient a range of fees, I've found that case acceptance drops dramatically. If I can tell a patient $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 for that implant, it's less important, the actual number, in my experience, than being able to give a solid number to the patient. And to be able to do that, you need to have good communication with your lab and your specialists so that you can come to that agreement on that number. Without any phone calls or letters or unsecure communication, you want to be able to say how much I can send an x-ray to my oral surgeon, and immediately they can send back and say, I don't need a bone graft here, I don't need a splint, let's say, and I know that total the cost is going to be $6,000. I tell Mrs. Jones before she leaves, it's going to be $6,000. My case acceptance for implants have shot up at least 10 times when we can give people a sound number and not say, well, I've got my fees, the oral surgeon has their fees. So we need to have a collaborative space to work together. And there are cloud-based platforms specifically for dentistry. I think that's important because this screen shows you a multitude of things that are specific for dentistry. On the upper left, there's a retainer. You know, you're not going to get that on Dropbox. There's a Dentsply photo on the upper right, and Ivoclar on the lower left. Opera DDS case is shown there. So specifically communicating with our colleagues is incredibly important and can happen instantly. So outside your office, it's important not just from getting everybody on the same page and working together in a collaborative space, but it reduces penmanship errors, which my penmanship is horrible. I'm sure many people's are in the profession, but it eliminates that sort of human error. Obviously, you can have a wrong keystroke, but it's much less likely than people not being able to read your handwriting. Also, the communication's instant. There's no mailing. There's no phone calls to return. You can get the information whenever you want it. It's more secure than paper, in my opinion, too. Paper slips get lost. If you send a referral to the endodontist saying, Jane Smith has a draining abscess on number 3, and you give that to Jane Smith, she loses that piece of paper. that's not very secure, you know. So being able to handle that information, being the sensitive information to be passed directly to our labs and specialists is important, in my opinion. We can also include many people. You can have the lab, the orthodontist, the implant provider, the surgeon, all in one place. It increases efficiency, and most importantly, it allows for better care. Everybody working in one place, communicating in one space, so the orthodontist hears what the surgeon says, the general dentist chimes in, so everybody's working in one place. It's easily tracked instantaneously. Truly makes for better care. So that's outside your office. Inside your office, how do we use cloud platforms to make our practices more profitable? Well, in my opinion, we can use them to focus on the patient. They're very full-featured and discrete, and I'll break this down a little bit. Here's kind of my philosophy when it comes to technology and case acceptance. There's a study done in medical school studies across several medical schools that found that 50% of all the medical students spend 50% of their time looking at a computer screen while they're with the patient. So people are looking at the charting and things. They're doing their diagnosis on screen with radiographs, and that's pulling the human element away from healthcare. And the same thing is going on in dental practices today. We're all looking at charts and radiographs on screens, and that direct patient contact, which is what leads to case acceptance. People don't trust you if you're not looking them in the eye, obviously, is a big piece of the problem. So we want to use technology to allow us to have good patient contact, not take us away from it. And in my opinion, headsets, which became very popular and they're kind of dropping in popularity, pull us away from that, because you're hearing chatter in your ear all the time, and you're actually sending that message to the patient that you're constantly listening to something else. Another piece of the puzzle is your staff need to work as a team. For example, if Jane comes in, gets a cleaning done, and says to your hygienist that it's sensitive on the upper right, and they have a conversation about it for 30 seconds or a minute, then you come in and you ask Jane, gee, is anything bothering you? And she says, well, I told her that it's on the upper right, that there's some sensitivity. That's a very different experience than if you come in asking Jane how, that you see, when you first walk in the operatory, you say, I'm sorry that you're having that sensitivity on the upper right, Jane, let's get it looked at. But if that information is passed along to you on the front end, it enables a much greater trust, which leads to case acceptance. So here's how I prefer, to talk about case acceptance and how to gain case acceptance. This is obviously speech. Your verbal communication is a whole other topic that we could talk about for a long time. But I believe that if the pieces of the verbal communication that you use is you walk in the room with confidence, your hygienist has already done the exam, has told you that number 3 needs to have a crown, and you say, I agree with Emily, she's the best hygienist, period, that's really the best way. You're giving a third-party endorsement saying that you agree with your hygienist, and you're backing up what she says. Now, it's not always possible, but we work really hard in our office to calibrate everybody to be on the same page. And to make this happen well, you need to have a good layer of intra-office communication. So I think the most important information that you get from your staff is before you enter the room. And here's why. The things that you should, in my opinion, get before you enter the room is that patient's chief complaint. You don't want patients to repeat themselves. We've all had that experience at the physician's office. It's very frustrating. Any treatment observations that they see, we want to be passed along to us, so we don't, again, there's no dual entry, so to speak. And there's lots of things that we want to be private. Most people have heard this saying that we want to give positive feedback publicly and negative feedback privately. When you have 3 people in an operatory, let's say the assistant, the dentist, and the patient, that's a public forum. So, for example, a hygienist talking about the horrible oral hygiene of a patient, she needs to floss more, her gums are bleeding in front of the patient is actually a shaming experience. And so we can sort of gently say it so that the patient knows that that information is being relayed. For example, in my office, I teach my hygienists to say, we discussed hygiene at length, but the details of that come through before I walk in the room. Similarly with divorce or health issues, you don't want to walk in and ask Jane about her husband Greg if they just got divorced. So I want that information before I walk in the room. So how do we get that information? Old school, and still the way that most people do it is yelling down the hall. We talked before about we don't want patients' perception to be that we're not focused on them. So if your hygienist comes to you and says, hey, I'm ready for an exam in Op 3 and Jane just got divorced, your patient in the chair is looking at you like, aren't you focused on me? We talked about headsets kind of sending that message all the time. You can pass notes, which we used to do in our office. It's actually very effective. We used to have laminated sheets for the information, but it's kind of cumbersome. It's not really discreet because anybody can see it. And there's server-based solutions. Most practice management softwares have a messaging application in them. There's ones that rest on your server, but there's limitations. Limitations to both what you can send and then where you can get it, what devices you can see it on. So my checklist kind of for an intra-office messaging system is I would want to get my messages anywhere, have it be easy to use, immediate, two-way communication that's secure, have it allow for private messages, get all the information I want, and important to me is to get it all in the same order because I'm a very linear thinker. I like to have things just like a pilot before taking flight. I want to know what information in the same order every time. So this is how we send the information in my office. Here's our checklist that comes through. Just an example of one. We've got the patient's name, chief complaint, changes in medical history, what radiographs were taken, perio status, restorative needs that the auxiliary found, and any personal items. So I get this every time in this order, which really drastically improves the experience, the patient experience, and case acceptance in my experience. And I just put this slide in here too because we've been playing around with the Apple Watch, and it's absolutely a game changer. Being able to get your notifications very subtly on your wrist immediately. I did not think it was going to be nearly as effective as it is. But the other watches I'm sure work equally as well. I'm just familiar with the Apple Watch because that's what we've been working on. But it really is the best use that I've found of the Apple Watch is getting your instant notifications on your wrist. So going to the last point, using these tools, these online collaboration tools and intra-office communication, what's the benefit to the patient? Why do the patients care? I think that technology is really just a tool, and patients really care how we make them feel. Like we talked about, getting away from the computer screen and using technology that is easy to use and get us back into the people business is most important. For example, I do a lot of CAD/CAM dentistry, use the CEREC a lot. I'm a CEREC trainer. And people don't care about the technology. What they care about is getting that crown that day, being able, and that it's beautiful. And so we want to use tools that provide a benefit to the patients, like intra-office communication that allows us to not spend time duplicating what we say in front of the patients and allows us to not be shaming to patients. And I think that electronic communication is excellent to increase patient care, case acceptance, and basically to decrease our stress in dental practices. Also, data security right now is smart business. I mean, it's the right thing to do. You send patients a secure email, they notice that. They notice that you are right now on the leading edge and that they care that you're doing that versus sending their x-rays through email. So what do patients like about technology? I think that we get more and more patients who just think technology is cool. There's reasons why Apple's just exploding. Google's obviously huge. People are buying more on Amazon. People like technology, and they like these types of cloud-based technologies. They're exploding everywhere else, but in medicine and dental, it's taken a little more time to take off. I think it also dovetails well with digital marketing, like great dental websites, as we talked about before. They're the masters of this, and particularly when you're doing, my point is that when you're doing digital marketing, you're probably going to be bringing in more technologically savvy patients. That technologically savvy patient is going to want to know that you're using the tools to keep that information secure. And if you send them something by fax or by mail, they're going to wonder why pretty soon, in my opinion. I think that online reviews and social media are effective, but I think Jeff would agree that a lot of that has to be done within your office and then broadcast out. And we talked about how patients coming in from these newer technologies are going to be more focused on you using cloud-based platforms too. And they certainly get the word out to other people once they know that you're up to date. And that's pretty much my presentation. I thank you very much for your time. Again, I very much appreciate Great Dental Websites for the opportunity, and I'll open it up for any questions that anybody has.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I have a couple questions for you. First of all, thank you for the kind words about us. And I have I jotted down a couple notes as you went through this. The auto updates to software, I don't think people appreciate how useful that is. In addition to something that's potentially a security hole, a lot of times when companies find security holes, they'll push out a patch quickly. But if you don't install the patch, you remain exposed. And if you have a network that's not really connected to the internet, this isn't a serious problem. But if it is, you might be just getting hit by these brute force attempts that are just programs trying to hack your network or your application. And I mean, our clients' websites get these types of hits probably, there's probably hundreds of these a day hitting our servers. And they just kind of bounce off. We monitor them, and they're usually unsophisticated, and they're trying things for different languages that we don't even support, but they happen. So if you have a well-known security hole that's unupdated, that's a big problem, and being on the cloud mitigates that to a certain extent. The other thing is what you said about the dental practice being a couple years behind the times, and some of the I've noticed that the more we work with dental practices, there are some dentists, and you're a notable exception to this, that seem to embrace every bit of technology. There's a dentist here in Denver, I know, Dr. Brent Kessler, who was formerly the president of the Colorado Dental Association, that will commonly see him with Google Glass on. But that's very few dentists are kind of on that bleeding edge. And there's a lot of tools like that, and Slack is a good one, that we've adopted within our organization that are phenomenal, and all of them are cloud-based because it's easier to push updates and it's easier to develop new features for. And what else did I want to say? Go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to piggyback on what you said because I think you made a very good point. I'm trying to get basically a lot of information out in a short period of time, and I agree completely about the importance of stressing the security advantages of auto updating. That's a great point. For example, I'm thinking of like one of the major practice management softwares. I had somebody come to me and say, well, my practice management software does email. Why do I need to use a HIPAA compliant email? It's in my practice management software. I asked them what version they were using, and it was a couple of years ago that they hadn't updated. And that practice management software had pulled the email system because it wasn't HIPAA compliant. So the person doesn't even know that they're not being compliant. They just assume that the technology that they were using 2 years ago is still legal and applicable today, and that's not the case. Also, for example, when we roll out something like email retraction as a new feature, it just is automatically there. You don't have to wait for the next release. So that was the point that I focused on. I appreciate you pointing out the security piece. That's huge. And yeah, it's funny because I think dentists are very technology focused in some areas, but when it comes to cloud-based, I think we're far behind pretty much everybody.
I think we haven't seen more of a adoption for cloud-based practice management systems like Curve. I'm honestly surprised that there aren't more competitors in that space, and everybody's still installing servers and having to deal with network requirements in their office. And part of that is probably the issue with worried about security and patient records. But I mean, there's so many other holes. What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think going to a system like, let me put it this way, putting your entire practice software online isn't, in my opinion, the best first step. I mean, we use CT scans, and if I put my entire system online, and I've talked with, we have a server-based practice management system in my office, and I've heard some very negative things about taking your entire practice management and putting it in the cloud. It's not as full featured. There's latency issues and things like that. I don't think that needs to happen. But when it comes to communication, when like the Slack-like collaboration tools, people aren't taking, people are still using Microsoft Word, on a local server most of the time. Obviously, they have Office 365 now. But when you're talking about your engine of your practice, the practice management software, I don't think that's the first thing to put in the cloud. But when you're talking about collaborating with people outside your office or being able to communicate from your phone, in my opinion, that's where we need to go. I think in the future, you're right. I think practice management software maybe completely will be in the cloud. But for right now, my opinion is that it's best to have a hybrid approach, to have some things on a local server, and then the things that the cloud really excels at, use it for just that.
One other thing that occurred to me, because we use Slack at our office, and one thing is the ubiquity of having people available, and as long as you don't abuse it, I found that my staff is fairly responsive. If a client calls us and has an urgent problem off hours, if you just need a quick answer from someone that's yes or no, or just like a sentence, having communication tools like this that work on all devices are very useful. And as long as you don't abuse it and expect your staff to be working 24/7, you may be surprised at being able to get a quick response if a patient calls you at home if you just send out a quick memo. I've done that when a client calls me at home in the evening, and sometimes I get a reply before I've even finished the phone call, and I can answer the question right there. So having tools like that are very useful. If you don't have any kind of communication system, that's not even possible. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, like, I'm an electrical engineer, and my background's in software, and I'm probably the kind of technologically focused or obsessed patient that you mentioned when you were talking about impressing patients who are into that. And I can tell you that from personally, if I saw an office that was using Apple Watches, that was using this communication system from their phone, and was really, if whenever I got any communication with them, it was always very secure, I would feel like I was being taken care of properly, and they were doing everything by the book, and they were doing everything in a way that would protect my privacy, which is something that's important to me, especially in the last couple of years where digital privacy is starting to become a concern when there's been a lot of, especially leaks politically. So it's, even if this is just a perception thing, I think it's a very positive perception for patients for not a lot of cost. So that was just one other final thought I wanted to share.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. When I started doing interoffice communication, for example, we had in our last office the light boxes, which I'm sure many people have, where you push the lights and then it buzzes. And the quote that I got from my office was $16,000 to put those in, and it was literally fake wood paneling, And then we've replaced that with a mini iPad that's stuck to the wall in the exact same location with 3M command strips in every operatory. And so you've gone from, it's almost like going from telegraph communication to text messaging. I mean, it's really not much different. That's not a stretch to make, and patients certainly notice that. They notice when you have an iPad on the wall, and they ask you why, and you can use it for other things. And we get, our new patients since we've gone to our new location have actually gone up 5 times in the last 3 years. They've quintupled, and in large part it's because of the technology use, because people notice it. And I think that dentistry as a whole is staying fairly level, but people are shuffling. They're moving from one practice to another, and they tend to be going to, there's some big trends in the industry. One which is multi-dentist. I think that's because you can have more convenient hours and things like that. And the other one is that people are seeking out technology, and not all technology. Technology doesn't need to mean a $150,000 CT scan. It can be using your computer you already have to send text messages securely between employees. I think that's a great point that you made.
Use the iPad for recording patient testimonial videos, which will help you with your marketing. So we're coming up on an hour here, and I think we have your contact information for how people can get a hold of you. There's your phone number up on the screen, and operadds.com is Bryan's website. I encourage anybody who's considering this type of communication system to check out Opera. I know we have a bunch of clients that use it, and I've heard good things. Thanks again, Bryan, for your time. Really appreciate it. Hope everybody finds this webinar useful. And thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.